All right, let's dive into this whole marriage thing. More specifically, what we wish we knew before jumping in, before saying, I do. We're looking at this podcast, The Sun Inside. It's all about what folks wish they'd known before getting married. And let me tell you, it gets pretty real.
Oh, for sure. It's so easy to get caught up in the fairy tale, right? Like the whole Hollywood ending thing. But then real life hits, and it's not always so glamorous.
Yeah, so ditch the rose-colored glasses, get practical. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And this podcast really emphasizes getting advice, like from people who've actually been there, done that. They even mention Proverbs 11.14 about having lots of counselors.
So not just any advice, but a whole bunch of perspectives. Not just from your friend who's like 3 months into their honeymoon,
Yeah.
but couples who've been through it all, the ups and downs.
That's the idea. Think about it. Who are those voices of experience in your life? It's something to consider, whether you're in a relationship or not.
That's a really good point. It's easy to get swept up in the excitement of a new relationship. But having those seasoned voices can ground you, help you see things clearly. Now, this podcast also talks about the husband as the head of the wife. They reference Ephesians 5.23, comparing it to Christ and the church. I know this can be a bit tricky for some people to grasp.
Oh, yeah, it definitely needs some unpacking. And, interpretations can vary. But maybe instead of a strict hierarchy, we can see it as different roles in the partnership. Roles that, work together, complement each other.
So more like shared responsibility and leadership.
Exactly. Like a dance, each partner has their own steps, but they move together. The podcast gives examples, like the wife creating a supportive home and the husband leading with understanding. Really makes you think, what do those words mean to you?
Right. What does support actually look like, practically? And what's healthy leadership in a relationship? It's not about one person calling all the shots, but about working together, both people bringing their strengths to the table.
Exactly. Shifting from me versus you to we. And the podcast acknowledges that marriage isn't in isolation. There's work, family, personal goals. It's a lot to balance.
Oh, for sure. It's a constant juggling act. You've got your own dreams, the needs of the partnership, everyday life. So how do you keep it all from falling apart? This podcast brings up Proverbs 22.6 about raising children. Now, that might sound like a parenting verse,
Huh.
but I think it applies to relationships too.
Definitely. It's recognizing that relationships, like kids, need nurturing to thrive. So how are you training up your relationship, so to speak? What are you doing to help it grow and stay healthy?
Right. It's about being intentional both in big ways and small ways. The podcast talks about making time for the relationship. Sure, everyone knows about date nights, but it's also those little moments of connection throughout the day.
Absolutely. Making your partner feel seen and heard, even when things are busy. So let me ask you this. If you're in a relationship, how are you making that time special? Protecting it from work, family, all the other demands. And if you're not in a relationship right now, what would that look like for you? What's non-negotiable for quality time?
Those are all such good things to think about. It's easy to get so focused on the big picture that we forget those small, everyday actions that build a strong relationship.
You're telling me, and let's face it, no relationship is perfect. Conflict is going to happen, even in the healthiest partnerships.
So how do you handle those rough patches without, sinking the whole ship?
Well, the podcast uses this image from Matthew 5.9 about peacemakers. I think that's really powerful. It's not about never arguing. It's about how you approach those disagreements.
So shifting from I need to win to let's find a solution together.
That's it. Remembering you're on the same team, and that takes communication, listening, and being ready to forgive.
Forgiveness, that's huge. Holding on to resentment, it's like carrying around a heavyweight. It drags you down, keeps you from moving forward.
You got it. And this podcast really emphasizes forgiveness, both for your partner, AD, for yourself.
Because let's be real, we all mess up sometimes. We make mistakes, we say things we regret. Holding on to that just creates more distance and pain.
And the podcast talks about communication being key. Not just talking, but really listening, trying to see things from their side.
That makes sense. So creating a space where both people feel safe to open up without feeling judged or criticized.
Exactly. When you feel safe and heard, you can be more vulnerable. Share your fears, your insecurities, work together to find solutions.
It builds trust and intimacy, knowing you can be your true self with your partner. And it's not all about words either. The podcast mentions nonverbal stuff too. Eye contact, body language, physical touch.
Yeah, sometimes a hug or a touch can say more than words. Those little gestures that say, I love you, I'm here for you. So what does effective communication look like to you? How do you create that safety and openness with your partner?
That's a good one to think about. Communication really is the thread that ties everything together in a marriage. Now, this might get a bit personal, but the podcast also talks about intimacy.
Ah, yes, intimacy. That word gets tossed around a lot, but what does it really mean?
Right. What are we actually talking about when we say intimacy?
Well, this podcast gets real about both the physical and emotional sides. Intimacy in a long-term relationship.
It's deeper than just the surface level, right? More than just the physical act.
Exactly. It takes communication, vulnerability, and prioritizing it, even when life is crazy. It's understanding each other's needs and desires, both physically and emotionally, and finding ways to meet those needs in a loving and respectful way.
The podcast also mentions keeping things fresh and exciting, trying new things, being spontaneous, having fun together.
Because intimacy isn't just about serious conversations. It's about laughter, joy, shared experiences that build memories.
It's those moments that make you feel connected, alive, in love. So, to wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'll leave you with this question. How do you define intimacy in a relationship? And how do you nurture it over time?
It's a good one to ponder. Because intimacy is the glue that holds it all together, the spark that keeps the flame burning bright.
You know, it's interesting. We often talk about losing ourselves in a relationship, but this podcast flips that. It highlights the importance of personal growth within marriage.
It is important. It's easy to get so focused on we that we forget me. But the podcast says investing in your own growth actually helps the relationship.
It's like adding fuel to the fire, right?
Yeah.
You bring a more vibrant, more evolved you to the partnership.
Exactly. It takes some pressure off your partner to be your everything. When you're fulfilled as an individual, you're not relying on your partner to meet every single need.
The podcast specifically talks about making time for hobbies, pursuing interests, even just having some alone time.
Yeah, it's about honoring your own passions and realizing you don't have to share every interest with your partner. You can support each other's growth while still being yourselves.
I love that. Celebrating those differences instead of trying to be perfectly matched. We've talked about a lot of practical things, but let's not forget the heart of it all. Love, respect, kindness. This podcast emphasizes these as the foundation of a strong partnership.
Absolutely. They're essential, the base for everything else. And the beautiful thing is, they're not just feelings, they're choices we make every day.
The podcast talks about choosing to love your partner even when they're not so lovable.
And choosing to see the best in them, even when they're struggling, giving them that grace and understanding we all need.
And choosing to speak kindly and respectfully, even during disagreements, remembering that you're a team, working through challenges together.
At the end of the day, marriage is two imperfect people choosing to love and support each other through the good times and the bad. It's a commitment to weather the storms together, knowing you have each other's backs no matter what.
And that's where forgiveness is so important. This podcast really drives home the importance of being willing to forgive, both yourself and your partner.
Because we all mess up. We stumble, we fall short. Holding on to resentment just poisons the relationship.
The podcast describes forgiveness as a gift to yourself and your partner.
It's about releasing the pain of the past, so you can move forward together with a clean slate.
It's not condoning bad behavior. It's choosing to let go of anger and resentment to make room for healing and growth. So as we wrap up this deep dive on marriage, I want to leave you with a question. What's one piece of advice you'd give to someone about to get married?
That's a good one. It makes you think about all we've learned from this podcast, from our own lives.
Because sometimes the best advice comes from those who've been there, not just from experts or books.
Exactly. That's what's so cool about these deep dives. It's not about giving all the answers. It's about starting conversations, challenging ideas, making you think deeper.
And we hope this deep dive has given you some new insights, some food for thought, maybe even some inspiration for your own relationships.
Remember, the journey of love is an adventure, full of challenges and rewards. Embrace the journey, learn from your experiences, and never stop growing.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So connect with us on social media and share your insights. Until next time, happy diving.
And that The Sun Inside title, it really sticks with you. It's not just about finding your own inner light, but nurturing that shared light as a couple.
It's a beautiful way to put it. But this podcast is quick to remind us, even the brightest sun has shadows. Relationships aren't always sunshine and rainbows.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, they argue that those tough moments, the ones where you face your weaknesses, need something bigger than yourselves. Those can be opportunities for growth, both as individuals and a couple.
That's like that saying, pressure makes diamonds. Sometimes the hardest things lead to the most amazing transformations.
Right on. And the host talks about how their faith helped them through those times. prayer, scripture, their religious community. Now, I know not everyone listening might share that faith, but the principle is the same. Whether it's faith, family, friends, even a therapist, having support outside the relationship is so important.
It's like a safety net. Those people you can turn to when things get rough. Someone to listen, offer a new perspective, or just be there for you. We all need that sometimes. Now, this podcast doesn't shy away from the less glamorous stuff either. They even talk about finances.
Oh yeah, money matters. It's a huge source of conflict for a lot of couples.
And for good reason. We all have different habits, goals, comfort levels when it comes to money.
It can be a touchy subject, which is why the podcast stresses talking about it before getting married, like debt, budgeting, long-term goals.
Yeah, getting everything out in the open.
It's about being transparent, setting realistic expectations. And that's a good lesson for anyone, relationship or not. Being open about your finances, even when it's uncomfortable, can save you a lot of trouble down the road.
Being on the same page financially. Working together to make a plan that works for both of you. Speaking of teamwork, what about kids? This podcast gets real about the joys and the challenges of parenthood.
Oh, they pull back the curtain for sure. The sleep deprivation, the constant demands, feeling pulled in every direction. It's not all cute baby pics and heartwarming moments.
But there are those precious moments, the ones that make it all worth it. It's like they say, the days are long, but the years are short.
So true. And it's easy to get so caught up in the day-to-day that you forget to savor those little moments.
To pause and appreciate them.
And the podcast host talks about how important it is to prioritize your marriage even when you have kids. Making time for date nights, adult conversations, connecting as a couple, without the kids being the center of attention.
Because it's so easy to let those things slip when you're tired and overwhelmed.
It is. But they remind us that nurturing your marriage is an investment in your family.
You're setting a good example for your kids, showing them what a healthy, loving relationship looks like.
Absolutely. Showing them that mom and dad are a team, that they make time for each other even when things are busy. So parents out there, how are you making time for yourselves? What are your strategies for keeping that spark alive?
It's a constant balancing act, but it's so worth it. Now, we can't talk about family without mentioning in-laws. This podcast acknowledges that navigating those relationships can be tricky.
For sure. Different expectations, communication styles, family dynamics, it can all lead to tension and conflict.
And a lot of couples struggle with that.
They do. The podcast offers some advice about setting boundaries, communicating clearly, and most importantly, presenting a united front.
That last one is key. It's about supporting each other, being on the same page with family stuff.
You're a team. You got to have each other's backs.
They also point out that you and your spouse are creating your own family, your own traditions, values, ways of doing things.
Finding that balance between honoring your families of origin and building something new together.
Your own little world.
Speaking of building something together, this podcast really hammers home the importance of communication in marriage.
Communication is key. Everyone says that. But it's more than just talking, right? It's really listening, trying to understand your partner's perspective, even when you don't agree.
Exactly. Making them feel heard and validated.
That their feelings are important.
And the podcast talks about creating a safe space for both partners, where they can express themselves without being judged or criticized.
When you feel safe, you can be more open and honest.
Exactly. Share your fears, your hopes, work through things together.
It builds trust and intimacy.
And it's not just about words either. The podcast talks about nonverbal cues too. Eye contact, body language, touch.
Sometimes a hug or a touch can say it all.
Those little things that say, I'm here for you, I care. So what does good communication look like in your relationship? How do you create that sense of safety and openness?
That's a good question to think about. Because communication really is the foundation of a strong marriage. Now, this might be getting a bit personal, but the podcast also talks about intimacy.
Yes, intimacy. What does that even mean? It's a word we hear a lot.
Right, but what are we really talking about?
Well, this podcast gets into the nitty-gritty, both the physical and emotional sides of intimacy in a long-term relationship.
Going beyond just the surface level.
Exactly. It takes communication, being vulnerable, and making it a priority, even when life gets hectic. It's about knowing what each other needs and wants, both physically and emotionally, and finding ways to meet those needs in a loving and respectful way.
The podcast also talks about keeping things fresh and exciting, trying new things, being spontaneous, having fun together.
Because intimacy isn't always serious. It's about laughter, joy, those shared experiences that create memories.
The moments that make you feel connected and alive. So, to wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'll leave you with this question. How do you define intimacy in a relationship? And how do you keep it strong over time?
That's a great question to reflect on. Because intimacy really is the glue that holds it all together.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We talk about losing ourselves in a relationship, but this podcast kind of turns that around. They say personal growth within a marriage is super important.
Yeah, it's like you're not just merging into one person.
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the we and forget about the me, but they say that investing in your own growth actually makes the relationship stronger overall.
So you're bringing a more well-rounded, evolved self to the table.
Exactly. And it takes some of that pressure off your partner, to be your everything. When you're fulfilled as an individual, you're not relying on them to meet every single need.
Right. The podcast talks about things like having hobbies, pursuing your own interests, even just having some alone time.
Yeah, it's about honoring your own passions, realizing you don't have to share every single interest with your partner. You can support each other's growth while still having your own identities. I love that. It's about celebrating those differences instead of trying to fit into some mold. We've talked about a lot of practical things, but let's not forget the heart of it all. Love, respect, kindness. The podcast really emphasizes those as the foundation of a good marriage.
Absolutely. Those are the building blocks, Everything else is built on that foundation.
And what's beautiful is that they're not just feelings.
Okay.
They're choices we make every single day.
Exactly.
The podcast talks about choosing to love your partner, even when, let's face it, they're not being very lovable.
Yeah, and choosing to see the best in them, even when they're struggling, offering that grace and understanding we all need.
And choosing to speak kindly and respectfully, even when you're disagreeing, remembering that you're a team, working through it together.
It all comes back to that teamwork. At the end of the day, marriage is about two imperfect people choosing to love and support each other through thick and thin. It's knowing you have each other's backs no matter what.
And that's where forgiveness comes in. This podcast really highlights the importance of being willing to forgive, both yourself and your partner.
For sure. Because we all make mistakes. We all mess up sometimes. And holding on to that resentment just eats away at the relationship.
The podcast describes forgiveness as a gift to yourself and to your partner.
I like that.
It's about letting go of the pain of the past, so you can move forward together with a clean slate.
Not condoning bad behavior, but choosing to let go of anger and resentment to make space for healing.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into marriage, I want to leave you with this question. What's one piece of advice you would give to someone who's about to get married?
That's a good one. It really makes you think about everything we've discussed, all the wisdom from this podcast, and our own experiences too.
Because sometimes the most valuable advice comes from people who've been there, not just experts or books.
Absolutely. That's the beauty of these deep dives, right? It's not about giving you all the answers. It's about sparking conversations, making you think, challenging your assumptions.
We hope this deep dive has given you some new insights, some things to think about, maybe even some inspiration for your own relationships.
Remember, love is a journey, not a destination. It's full of ups and downs, but it's a beautiful adventure.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so connect with us on social media and share. Until next time, happy diving.